There we are. Awesome. Okay, I'm Lisa. I'm the founder of Ivy Tutors Network. We are in our 21st school year of preparing kids for the SHSAT exam, although the difference is a lot of people call it SHSAT now. 20 years ago, it was SHSAT. So we're in our 21st school year of prepping kids for SHSAT. We just finally got all of our numbers from last year, and so 2 years ago, 84% of our students received an offer. And this year, I think we're like very close to 86, 85.9 or something like that. So very, very exciting statistics. It's wonderful to see everyone, sometimes start off with a relatively low score and work really hard and get into their dream school. We love that. So I'll let Sid introduce themselves in just a minute, but just to go through this agenda, we're just going to talk about the basics of the SHSAT. We're going to take you through the ELA portion, the English language arts, the math portion, and also give you some awesome test taking strategies. And then we'll leave time for questions. If you have questions throughout, since there are two of us on here, if you want to put them into the Q&A or the chat, I'll see if Sid can answer them while they present. Sid, if you want to say a few words about you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been tutoring for over 5 years. I currently teach two semi-private SHSAT classes on Sundays, and I also teach one-on-one. So even before I was with you this morning, I was teaching a pair of twins some SHSAT strategies and going over their
Oh,
first SHSAT test, diagnostic test. And I love teaching SHSAT. It's really fun to kind of be able to navigate what these strategies look like. And a lot of it is kind of figuring out how to interpret questions. And we'll get to that as we go
yeah,
over some of our examples today.
awesome.
I graduated from Yale in 2023,
Awesome.
and I currently live in New York City, and I'm very excited to be working for Ivy Tutors.
Awesome. Thanks, Sid. I'm excited to learn from you. All right. So should we start with what is the SHSAT? And for those, I think we have a mixed, some people here have started studying, some haven't. So I just decided let's go through the basics. Let's race through it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what is the SHSAT or the SHSAT? It's made up of two different parts, the English language arts section and the mathematics section. They both have 57 questions. The ELA section comes in kind of these two parts, revising and editing. We'll go over some examples of that, and then reading comprehension. So lots of different
Perfect.
kinds of passages. And then the math part comes in these grid-in sections, and then multiple choice. And it's the whole test itself is about 3 hours. It's exactly 3 hours without any
Mhm.
breaks. You can choose if you want to start with the ELA or the math or switch back and forth. You can skip over questions and come back to it. You guide your time, you guide the order in which you do the questions. And it happens usually at the end of October. We won't get the dates until much closer to then.
Yeah. Yeah. I think last year it was like the first week of November, but right around there for sure.
So this is kind of just an overview of what some of the cutoffs have looked like in previous years for different schools and the number of seats that they have, just so you can kind of get an idea. And I think, have this on our website as well.
Totally. Yeah. But I will say if you're just starting out on your test prep journey, don't worry too much about these numbers. It can seem like impossible to get into the 500s, but this is a test that rewards people who study for it. So you're supposed to study for this test. That's what, differentiates students who really do well at these schools and who thrive at these schools. These are students who really want to be there and who studied hard to get there. That's kind of the point of this test.
I will say that I had students who took the diagnostic back in January who were
Yeah.
in the 300 range, who are now in the 500 range after a couple
Wow.
months of
That's
tutoring.
pretty
So
cool.
it does happen. It happens all
Yeah.
the time. That's why we tutor.
Yeah, exactly. And test prep I always say is like three things, right? It's learning the content and then learning the strategies and then doing lots of practice. So it sounds like those students, it's not their fault. They're great students, but they just hadn't learned some math facts and some grammar things. So they just needed to learn those things and fill in the content gaps, I think.
Exactly. So yeah, just another kind of chart to explain or kind of show what some of these different
Yeah.
scores cutoffs have looked like in previous years. So let's jump in with some
Yeah.
revising and editing. So the first section of our English language arts, kind of even the revising and editing section comes in two parts. So the first is individual sentences and paragraphs. And that's going to look at things like grammar, combining sentences, punctuation. And then part B is going to be usually one or two longer passages. And those will have questions such as, where would this sentence be best located in this passage? Or if you were going to add a concluding sentence to this passage, what would that be? So I'll show some examples of that very shortly. But the next slide.
Great.
So, okay, so here's an example of part A, our kind of the part of the section of ELA revising and editing, where we're looking at individual sentences, shorter excerpts. So let's read this question. Flyby missions near Jupiter have been happening since 1973. That's sentence 1. And 2, flyby missions allow scientists to collect data about Jupiter and its moons. What is the best way to combine these sentences to clarify the relationship between the ideas? So when we see a question that says something about clarifying the relationship, what we want to be paying attention to are transition words. Is the relationship between sentence 1 and sentence 2 causal? Does the fact that the scientists collect data, is that why there's more missions near Jupiter? Or is it just offering us more information? So when I look down at the different multiple choices, we have words like while, although, which, and but. And we kind of want to pay attention to, what do we think? Is it that the flyby missions have been happening near Jupiter, but the scientists have been collecting data? Oh, I see somebody dropping answers in the chat, and you're welcome as you want to participate in that way as well.
Cool.
I would agree with you. I think C is our best answer. Does anybody want to say why they maybe think C is the best answer? Yeah.
We have a raised hand.
Are we allowed to can we have folks participate vocally? Does that work? Or is it just,
Sure. Let's try it.
what do you think? Why do you think that C is the best answer? It clarifies relationships between the sentences best. So what is the relationship between those two sentences? I don't know if we can have other folks unmute. It might not work. But what I'm noticing
I think there might be too many people here to have people interact. I love that idea. We definitely do that in our semi-privates.
Yes, we absolutely do. That's mostly how a semi-private looks like, but because of this format, it's not quite as conducive. But the way that these two are interrelated is flyby missions near Jupiter, which allow scientists to collect data about the planet and its moons, have been happening since 1973. It's not that the scientists have been collecting data because of 1973 or anything like that. The way that we know it's the best answer is this one kind of just provides a little more information. They're not necessarily a causal relationship or a contrasting or a contradictory relationship. So we don't want to use words like although or but. And so which is our most precise, our best way of saying what we want to say. We can continue on to the next question.
Definitely.
So this one is still part of that part A, but it's a paragraph this time. And this time we're looking at grammar. We're looking at kind of conjugation, and we're looking at punctuation. Or not conjugation, we're looking at verbs. So like we're looking at verb conjugation. So is it a plural? Is it singular? So we're looking at the sentence or this paragraph. So I'll start off from the top. Both Italian gelato and American ice cream are delightful treats to have on a hot summer day, but many people wonder, what is the difference between the two? To start with, the butterfat content is much higher in ice cream than it is in gelato, making the Italian treat a wiser decision for people looking to make healthier choices. Additionally, the mixing process, which adds less air to the frozen meat, makes gelato denser than ice cream. Finally, gelato is served 10 to 15 degrees warmer than ice cream, which enhances the texture and flavor of the gelato and allow it to melt more quickly. So I already noticed people saying H. I would agree with you. I think H is the best choice. The reason H is the best choice is because gelato is singular. You can even look earlier in the sentence, gelato is. So when we're looking at what the word allow should be singular too. It should be allows, not allow, because gelato is singular. And also we don't need that comma because which enhances the texture and flavor of the gelato and allow it to melt more quickly is all part of that same dependent clause. It needs to be together. You only would add in a comma if it was a separate idea or part of a list, which it isn't. So let's continue on to the next one, just because I want to make sure we can get through as much content as
Of
possible.
course. I just want to say that I think that ice cream also has eggs in it, while gelato doesn't.
That's good to know.
Egg yolks.
So, so
Yeah.
these are examples of part B of the passage section of the ELA, revising and editing. So in this case, they're asking us, where would you move sentence 10 to better be structured in paragraph with the paragraph that's sentences 6 to 10? Or which revision to sentence 12 best maintains the formal style established in the passage? Without knowing what the passage looks like, we can't answer either of these questions. And that's kind of the special part about part B, is that it forces you to kind of look at something in its full context, to think about, what is the main idea here? And how would we best rewrite and revise and edit this paragraph for the structure to be better, or for this sentence to come before that sentence? That's kind of how part B of the ELA revising and editing section looks.
Yeah.
So big things to know for your revising and editing, the tips, the tricks, are to know your grammar. That's important for both the SHSAT and for high school. And then read lots of nonfiction. Read the news, read books on a nonfiction topic that really interests you. Maybe you're really into astronomy. Maybe you are fascinated with architecture. Those kinds of things are great to read and learn a lot about, because those kinds of things pop up in your SHSAT.
Totally. I think the revising and editing a lot of our students have trouble with at the beginning, because a lot of elementary and middle schools have stopped really teaching the grammar rules. So this is a case where you just have to learn them, and you just have to practice using them and start to understand them. And the good thing about that is, when you are starting to learn a language in middle school or high school, it's going to be much easier to learn a second language if you know your grammar. So this will definitely help you in the future. And about reading, I mean, I can't emphasize this enough, how important it is to read nonfiction. Some parents ask us, like, but my kid really likes video games. What can I read? I mean, there are magazines out there about video games. It's just really important to be like reading something that, maybe magazine or newspaper or something that comes every week, if not every day, that you look forward to, that, on a schedule. Yeah, sometimes, when students are studying for standardized tests like this one, but also like when you're in high school and it's the SAT, we also say, like, read on an e-reader if possible, if you have an iPad or a e-reader, because if you don't know a word, you can long click on it and it defines it for you. So that's another trick.
Yeah, I'll add one more tip to the revising and
Yeah.
editing, which is sometimes you can just read a sentence and you'll hear it and you'll say, this doesn't sound right. So maybe for folks in that passage that was about gelato and ice cream, you just read that last sentence and you said, something about this feels wrong. And that's honestly one of the first parts of revising and editing, is trying to trust and learn your instincts. Because sometimes our ears know these things and we've heard them conversationally, but we just don't necessarily know on a paper until we learn exactly what the rule's called. You might notice that a dangling modifier sounds weird, but until you learn what that is, it might be harder to identify what exactly feels weird or feels wrong about that sentence. So that's something that we learn, is we trust our instincts, we learn what our instincts are, and then we learn why they're right.
Totally.
So for our reading and comprehension section, there's at most 6 texts, usually 5 to 6 texts, and there will be a poem, there'll be some prose, some like a novel or a story, a memoir, and then some history or science is kind of what the breakdown looks like for those texts.
Great.
And so this is an example of a prose piece, but it actually has, or a poem. This one, I remember reading this in one of the passages. It's kind of written, it's a poem, but it's written in a more non-traditional style. And you can't actually see this, but I'm going to describe this to you. This poem is written to look like this. You can see only one part of it, but that actually is going to be really informative for how we answer this question.
Interesting.
Because let's read the poem and let's read the question. So Brush Creek stood low when the museum men came with their measuring tapes and sketchbooks. It was winter, fringed with ice. The creek doubled back on itself as if it had forgotten something. Pa was in Cincinnati, or else on his way home. So Ma told me to lead the men into the marshy low grounds. It being winter, there was little underbrush to speak of. Question 42, how does the poem's form contribute to the poem's meaning? So form is big, like flashing headlights. You want to pay attention to what does it physically look like? And so that's why I told you the poem kind of looks like this. We're only seeing a small chunk of the whole poem, but it kind of snakes back and forth. And our options are the use of one continuous stanza and the pattern of lines mimic the long and winding shape of the mound. F, the uneven line lengths emphasize the variety of ways people interpret the meaning of the mound. G, the dashes throughout the poem highlight the speaker's changing thoughts about the significance of the mound. Or H, the lack of a regular rhyme scheme and meter convey that the speaker struggles to comprehend the vastness of the mound. So in this case, there's only a couple answers that are really about the form, right? In this case, our best answer is going to be E, because we're kind of looking at what is the actual structure of this poem. And the poem is actually built to kind of look like a winding shape, because in the end, one of the interpretations is that this shape is a mound that's supposed to be a snake. You don't know that from this small excerpt, but that's kind of me cluing you into what that form is and kind of how we interpret those kinds of questions.
Definitely. Another area where most students need to learn words like stanza, but that's okay. You learn it and you know it the rest of your life. So good time to learn some poetry vocabulary for this test.
So here are a couple other types of reading comprehension questions. And so these are all somewhat about figurative language, tone, imagery. So one of the big things that we go over when we're learning about reading comprehension are some of like our big figurative language terms, things like onomatopoeia, simile, metaphor, things that students have generally maybe heard of in a class, but haven't gotten to really practice trying writing out themselves or identifying in the kind of literature that they read. So I just grabbed a couple of different little excerpts that practice some of these strategies. So this sentence from paragraph 7, sometimes we think he didn't think he'd ever get the bite of last winter's cold out of his bones. What does the figurative language in this sentence emphasize? Does anybody want to identify what they think the figurative language is? What kind of figurative language it is? You can drop in the chat if you think, and while I'm doing this, I'll kind of explain. So he didn't think he'd ever get the bite of last winter's cold out of his bones. What does it emphasize? A feeling of regret about Boone's Fort. B, a sense of sadness that Drew has found new purpose in life. C, a sense of pride and confidence in Drew's skills and abilities. Or D, a feeling of exhaustion and weariness as Drew considers his life. So I would say D is our best choice. He's exhausted because he can't get the bite of the cold out of his bones. And he's weary. He's really, there's kind of, he didn't think that he'd ever get it out. There's like a sense of not knowing what the future will look like in terms of that feeling. Is it going to stay with him forever? So that's kind of what that emphasizes. And yeah, I would say that winter can bite is a personification, because we know that winter is a season. Winter doesn't have teeth. So in this case, they're kind of personifying winter, that it has this bite. And then for the next question, read these sentences from paragraph 1. I luckily had invested heavily in American assets, so I shall never have to open a tea room in Monte Carlo or drive a taxi in Paris. So in this case, we're kind of paying attention to the tone, to the attitude. And in this case, the best answer is contempt. He says, I luckily, you can kind of read it in your own voice and think, he's kind of saying, oh, I don't have to do those things. In this case, you might not know what the word contempt means. But you can say, does it seem like he's respectful of somebody who opens a tea room or drives a taxi? He says that he's lucky he doesn't have to. So you can kind of rule off it's not necessarily respect, reverence, or acceptance, because those all kind of have a positive slant to them. And in this case, he's saying, I'm lucky I don't have to do those things. He's judgmental. And that's kind of, you can notice sometimes with attitude questions, if 3 of the answer choices seem very similar or all have a very positive attitude, and that's not the tone or the attitude of the passage, then you know that the one that's different is probably your best choice. And then this last question, One could not promenade throughout without risking his neck. At one moment, the bowsprit was taking a deadly aim at the sun in mid-heaven, and at the next, it was trying to harpoon a shark in the bottom of the ocean. So this is some pretty sensory imagery. And in this case, what is it kind of helping establish? Not necessarily the purpose of the trip. We don't know that necessarily. The sense of the surrounding conditions. Maybe let's keep reading the answer choices. The aspects of the ship that the narrator likes most. Does he seem really excited about risking his neck? I don't think so. There's a deadly aim. I think we can notice words like that and say maybe that's not what the narrator is looking forward to. And the narrator's feelings towards his fellow passengers. It's more about the surrounding conditions, right? Because there's shark, there's like the chance that you might get hit by the bowsprit. So I think we say sense of surrounding conditions is our best answer for that one. On to the next. So this is kind of, if you had, we're just taking out a short paragraph, but generally the way that these reading comprehension examples are set up is that you have a full passage, and then at the very end of the passage, you have a series of questions. Sometimes they're in order in the relevance that they have for particular sections. So you might notice sometimes the first question that's asked at the end of a passage is about the beginning of the passage, and the last questions that's asked is more about the overall idea of the passage. That's generally how they're structured. Some folks, and one of the strategies that we recommend is actually reading the questions first before you read the passage so you can know what to pay attention to. So you might read this question 11, actually before you read the passage, Wolves of the Sea. The details in paragraph 1 contribute to a central idea of the passage by showing the Deramont. So you might say, okay, I know that there's a question that's going to ask me to focus on what the central idea of the passage is. So the whole time I'm reading this passage, I want to be thinking, what is the central idea? What is the point of this passage? So let's read Wolves of the Sea and see what we think. The cool and misty landscape of the Great Bear Rainforest can be found along the coast of British Columbia, Canada, and its nearby islands, from Vancouver Island to the Alaskan border. Within this protected area, wolves roam the forests, islands, and beaches. When biologist Chris Deramont began to study these wolves, he wanted to confer with the local First Nations groups, as Aboriginal Canadians are known, in order to learn what they knew about these wolves. He spoke with Chester Starr, an elder of the Haistuk Nation that has occupied the Great Bear Rainforest for thousands of years. When Starr had to say about the wolves changed Deramont's perception of the animals. So the details in paragraph 1 contribute to the central idea of the passage by showing that Deramont, A, believed that the Great Bear Rainforest was an ideal location to study wolves in their natural habitat because it is a protected area. B, values different perspectives because the information that Starr provided influenced the focus of Deramont's research. C, thought that the Great Bear Rainforest could provide opportunities to study different groups of wolves because the area includes forests and islands. Or D, understands the importance of respecting local community members because Deramont sought permission from an elder of the Haistuk Nation before starting his research. So I'm seeing in the chat a C. And we don't have the whole passage. So this is, I'm giving you a bit of a challenge here because we don't actually see what is this whole passage about. You might be hard to say, what is the central idea from just this small chunk? But in this case, and I'm seeing there's a variety of answers, I think this one's actually a pretty hard question. I would agree that it's not, with the little excerpt that we had, it can't be totally clear. But I would say our best answer is actually B. Eric said it. And why might that be? Because the others involve some degree of inference. And one of the big things to watch out for in the ELA reading comprehension section is that they want you to take what you have on the page. And sometimes it's easy to take a little extra leap and say, well, if this is true, then this must be true. But they want you to say, what exactly is this text giving me? And so we don't necessarily know that he understands the importance of respecting local community members. It doesn't say that he particularly sought this region because of it being a protected area or because it had all these different types of environments. But what we do have is that he wanted to confer with the First Nations groups in order to learn what they knew about this wolf. So we know for sure that the reason why he did this was because he wanted to understand a different perspective than his own. And that changed his perception of the wolves. So B is our best answer choice. But again, I would say this one is a challenge. So here's some of our strategies. You can skim the text, use the questions to understand the text. And the other thing that we really recommend students do is skip over a text. If you know you're really not feeling as strong about your poetry, spend the majority of your time on the nonfiction and the fiction, and come back to the poetry if you have time at the end. Because this, with 3 hours, you choose how you spend your time. So if you're spending 30 minutes on one passage, that's preventing you from getting to all the stuff that you do know how to do. So one strategy that I teach my students is this red light, yellow light, green light strategy for their questions. You want to start with all of the questions that are an immediate green light for you. So if you know, for example, I'm really good at nonfiction, you want to do those nonfiction passages first, and then you might feel like, okay, I need a little bit more thought when it comes to fiction passages. So I'll save this passage that seems like it's, an excerpt of a novel. I'll save this and I'll do that afterwards. You spend a little more time with those. And then if there's any questions in any of those sections and you say, I'm going to spend 5 minutes on this question alone, skip over it, mark it in your book, and come back to it so you can spend your time doing the stuff that you know how to do. Because a lot of this test is just time management. So some other tips, you can develop a personal annotation style. Some of my students like to write like one word or a short phrase at the end of each paragraph, or highlight or underline the thesis statements or the main ideas, so they kind of know what to return to, or if there's words that they don't know, they'll circle those to kind of understand the context. Learn how to stay interested while reading. It's a long time to be working on the same test, and so it's normal to get kind of tired if you're doing the same thing for such a period of time. The key is to practice it. So to practice doing your homework in one sitting. One thing that we do, or at least that I do with my semi-private classes, is I assign an hour of homework, and I tell the students, try to do all of this homework in the same hour. I'm going to give you about 30 minutes of reading and 30 minutes of ELA and 30 minutes of math. You choose what order you do them. You choose how much you spend on each section, but try to do it in one sitting so you practice that muscle of being in one place and focusing for an hour, because we're used to scrolling on our phones and doing things really fast, and it's a skill to build up. And then read more. Do more reading for fun. Read poetry, older literature, nonfiction. Ask your friends what they like to read. Ask your parents what they like to read, or your guardians, and take the recommendations and try to work on finding things that interest you to keep engaged. Okay, math section. So for the math section, as I said before, there's 57 questions. It's broken down into 5 grid-ins and 52 multiple choice questions. And our overall topics are algebra, geometry. There's usually a couple questions about probability or combinatorics, and then there's some word problems. The other thing I would add into that is there's percent change and like sales tax and those kinds of questions as well. Okay, so let's go over a couple of these. So this kind of gives you a sense of what some of these questions are. I think these are actually pulled from a real diagnostic test, a real SHSAT test. So what's the value of x in the equation shown above? This is basic algebra. You want to do 12 times 12 to get 147 minus x by itself. So that's going to be 144. 147 minus x is 144. You can notice, okay, so then x has to be 3 to get it from 147 to 144. So the answer, the value of x is 3. Going on for 77, what's the value of x when y is 3? You can plug in 3 here. 36 divided by 3 is going to be 12. 12 equals 4x. 12 divided by 4 will give you x equals 3. So that's going to be A. Yeah, I see people dropping their answers in the chat. Really nice. And then 76, in this case, you're going to solve, it's like solving for an equation, but it's solving with an inequality. So you have to subtract 8 from both sides, and then you get 84. 3x is less than or equal to 84. You can divide both sides by 3, and because it's a positive number you're dividing by, the inequality stays the same direction. If you're in my class, we can talk a lot about inequalities. I know that's something that not a lot of schools cover in depth. And then what you get is that x is less than or equal to 28, but they're asking you not how many numbers satisfy this inequality, but how many positive odd numbers satisfy this inequality. So between 1 and 28, there are only 14 odd numbers. 1, 3, 7, 9, 5, 9, it goes onward, and you can count them. Or you can say 28, half of the numbers between 0 and 28 are going to be even, and half of them are going to be odd. So the answer is going to be 14F. Make sense? And then for 86, and I really appreciate everybody engaging. I'm sorry I'm not able to interact with all the answers at this moment, but I really appreciate you going through them yourself. That's often how we'll do class, is we'll do part of the time, I'll kind of explain and walk through a problem, and then I'll give the class a couple problems to work on by themselves, and then we'll come together and go over the questions and go over the answers. But because we have a limited amount of time here and it's not as much of an interactive format, I'm just kind of throwing the answers at you. So thanks for rolling with me. And then if W minus 1 is an odd integer, which the following must be an even integer. So for example, for this could be a plug-in one. You could pick a number. So let's pick an odd integer. Let's pick 3. So but we're saying W minus 1 is an odd integer. So actually we have to say W has to be an even integer. So let's say our W is going to be 4. So 4 plus 1 is 5. That's not even. 8 minus 1 is 7. That's not even. 8 minus 2 is 6. That's even. Let's keep doing the next one. 8 plus 1 is 9. So the only correct answer is going to be G. Otherwise, you're going to get an odd integer. Okay, so now we're at some different, area, volume, these kinds of questions. So R, S, and T are midpoints on the sides of the square of M and PQ. What is the sum of the areas of the shaded triangles? The trick here is that your diagrams are never going to be drawn to scale. So don't trust what you see in your diagrams, but trust what they tell you. So what is a midpoint of 6? So you know that one side of the square is 6. The midpoint of 6 is going to be 3, right? So you know this side of this triangle is 3. This side of this triangle is also going to be 3 because it's a square. So half of one side is always going to be the same as half of another side. 3 times 3 is 9 times 1/2 is 4.5 is going to be the area of one of these triangles. And you're finding the area of 2 of these triangles. So the total area is going to be 9 centimeters squared, or squared centimeters. In the quarter circle above, what is y in terms of x? So what do we notice about x plus 1? What does that look like? Anybody know what the term would be? What I'm looking for? It's a classic circle term. So it is the hypotenuse of the triangle, but I'm actually looking for what it is in terms of this quarter of a circle. Does anybody have any idea what this might be? I can just say it's a radius. So a radius is the center of the circle. Yeah, a center of the circle to an outside point of the circle. So x plus 1 is the radius of the circle. But also, what else do we notice? Y plus 2 is also going to be a radius of the circle. And the radius has to be equal at this point, at this point, at this point, at all of those points. It's always going to be the same. So we can actually set up an equation where x plus 1 equals y plus 2. So now we want to solve what is y in terms of x. Y plus 2 equals x plus 1. You can subtract 2 from both sides. And then you have x 1 minus, or x minus 1 is going to be what our y is. Does that make sense to folks? Yeah, let's keep going. All right, so this is a probability question. We have a ball selected from a box of balls. There's 7 black balls, 14 green balls, and 21 red balls. So what's the probability that the ball selected is black? In order to figure it out, we first need to add together all of the balls. There's 7 plus 14, which is going to be 21, plus 21 is going to be 42. And then how many black balls are there over 42? 7 over 42. You can simplify that because 7 also goes into 42, and it simplifies to 1/6. In this question, Jack scored a mean of 15 points per game in his first 3 basketball games. In his 4th game, he scored 27 points. So what is his mean score for the first 4 games? So for this case, it's kind of like going backwards from an average. So we know that the average of the first 3 is 15. So the total is always going to be to find the average, you do the average equals the total over the number. So in this case, to find the total, we're kind of going backwards. The total is going to be the number of games times the average. So 15 times 3 is 45. So we know what the total from the first 3 games is 45. And then in the 4th game, he scored 27 points. So in this case, we can add 27 plus 45 from the first 4. And then we'll divide that by 4 to get our average. And so our actual new mean, I believe if I'm doing my mental math correctly, would be 18. 112. So 1 SIND equals 5.6 RICs, and 1 6 also equals 12.88 DALTs. So you could go into a lot of depth and figure out exactly what this conversion is, or you could say, if there's 12, almost 13 RICs in 1 SIND, and that's about twice as much as the number of RICs in 1 SIND, how many, or if there's 12, like almost 13 DALTs for every 1 SIND, and there's 5.6 RICs for every 1 SIND, there's about twice as many, right? So how many DALTs do we think are in 1 RIC? You might look at that and say, actually, I'm pretty sure that's F. That just makes sense, right? For 86, if W minus 1 is an odd integer, we actually, I think, just did this one, so we can keep going. We did that one on the last slide.
Great. Yeah, I just want to say for 112, it's such a great strategy, to kind of slow down and say, if I were to do all this math, it would take me a really long time, especially without a calculator, with decimal places, 2 decimal places. But you can kind of step back and use common sense and not have to do the math and do that one quite quickly and gain some time on a harder question.
Yeah,
Love
and we really encourage common sense. There are some questions that look really scary if you just look at the question. For example, I often do this question about loaves of bread. And there's actually, and they'll say on Tuesday, there were 40 more loaves of bread than there were on Wednesday. And on Thursday, there were 20 less loaves of bread than there were on Wednesday. And there are certain, if you say that there's 20 less loaves on Tuesday, then whatever you had on Wednesday has to be more than 20, because otherwise you're going to have negative loaves of bread. So there's actually, in this kind of question, there was only one correct answer, because in the other situations, you have negative loaves of bread, but you can't have negative loaves of bread.
It's true.
So here are a couple word problem examples, and I'm sorry we're rushing through this, but I want to make sure we have time for your Q&A, and we can go back to any of these. If anyone is like, I remember this question from this slide, I want to make sure that we do this one together. I'm happy to go back and do these a little with, some more time. So 3 students stand at the starting line of a running track and begin running laps at the same time. Anne completes 1 lap every 2 minutes, Jack completes 1 lap every 3 minutes, and Lee completes 1 lap every 4 minutes. How many laps does Anne complete before all 3 runners are once again at the starting line at the same time? So the first thing that you might want to notice is, what kind of problem is this? You could kind of draw a diagram for yourself and be like, Anne completes 1 lap every 2 minutes, Jack completes 1 lap every 3 minutes, and Lee completes 1 lap every 4 minutes. And say, how do we all get back at the starting line at the same time? Or you can think about it, it's actually a least common multiples problem, right? Every 2 minutes, every 2 times, Anne is going to be back at the line. Oh, that's funny. I don't know where those balloons came from. Every 3
That's been happening to me also on Zooms. There's like some kind of like hand motions, I think, that kick them off.
Very funny.
Yeah.
Jack is going to complete a lap every 3 minutes, and Lee is going to complete a lap every 4 minutes. So the next time that Anne completes a lap, it's going to be 4 minutes. It's going to be 6 minutes. It's going to be 8 minutes. Does she have an overlap at 6 minutes? She has an overlap with Jack, but she doesn't have an overlap with Lee. So we need to keep going. At 8 minutes, does she have an overlap? She has an overlap with Lee, but not with Jack. Another one. What about 10 minutes? 10 minutes, she doesn't have an overlap with anybody. What about 12 minutes? At 12 minutes is when she has an overlap with all 3 runners. But they're not asking us how many minutes it's been. They're asking how many laps she made. So that's tricky. That's another part of these questions is your first instinct might be like, oh wait, it's 12 minutes. The answer's 12, but they're asking us not for how many minutes it's been, they're asking us for how many laps she's made. So in that case, she's made 1 lap is 2 minutes, 2 laps is 4 minutes, 3 laps is 6 minutes, 4 laps is 8 minutes, 5 laps is 10 minutes, and 6 laps is 12 minutes. So she's made 6 laps by that amount of time. Then 110 at North High School, a survey asked 2 questions, question A and question B. For each question, students could answer either yes or no. Of the 800 students who responded to the survey, 720 answered yes, and 640 to question A, and 640 answered yes to question B. What's the least possible number of these students who could have answered yes to both questions? So if we have 800 students, then for the first question, we only had 8 students who said no, 80 students who said no, right? We have to know that there's gotta be, and that means that that we know at least 720 students said yes to the first question, right? So we know it's gonna be more than 80 students, right? Because we know that, and also whether it's 640 said yes to the second question. That means that only 160 said no to the second question. So we actually know that the most that could have said no is going to be, it's going to have to be 560 is our answer, but it's this one's a little confusing. The way you have to know is that you can't have more students say, if you have to have at least 560 students say yes to both questions, because you know that you only have 800 students. And so the most that could have not said yes to both is the 120 that 160 that said no to question 2. That one's a little complicated, and if I had more time, I would go into more depth with it. But let's keep going. They're trying to trick you. Keep an eye out for trap answers. Like I said, with that one that you thought maybe it was going to be 12 minutes, but then you had to read carefully and say how many laps is it, and it's only 6 laps. Diagrams are not drawn to scale. So those examples that we had of the quarter circle or the square that's broken down into different pieces, they're tricky. Don't trust only trust what they tell you and what they like explicitly will like point out to you. But you can't always look at this and say, this piece looks about the same as this piece, so they must be equal, because those graphs are not drawn to scale. And then the long word problems are going to be confusing. So just my trick that I do is I'll highlight exactly what they're asking for. If they're asking for the median, then I want to make sure I highlight the word median. If they're asking for the total, I want to make sure I'm looking for the total and not the average, or looking for the total and not a percent. Things like that can be kind of tricky. So just paying attention to exactly what they're asking for. For example, you might have a question that asks how much money is left in a bank account after you have 20% interest over 10 years. And your instinct might be to find exactly what that 20% interest is, but they're asking how much money is in the account. So you have to add that 20% to the original amount. Those are kind of the tricky questions, just paying attention to what exactly they're asking for and making sure that's what you're solving for. Because they probably will include in the answer choices whatever that 20% is, in addition to what the total afterwards would be. And you have to kind of go past maybe your first gut reaction to say, oh, that's 20%, to, oh, wait, they're asking me for the total after this amount of time. So I have to add that 20% to the original amount. and then there's no formula or calculator. So that's another big thing that we practice in class, is just doing math on paper. Because sometimes we aren't used to doing long division with decimals on a piece of paper. A lot of us have access to calculators at every step along the way. But this test requires us to do a little bit, to do math either in our head or to do math on a piece of paper. So we practice that. Practice, lots of official tests, and especially word problems. And then we get familiar with the basic math and arithmetic. We don't get formulas for what the area of a circle is or what the surface area of a cone is. So part of it's also practicing what and remembering what those formulas are so you can review them on your own time. And then it helps us save time and eliminate making mistakes. We prep early. We start with the diagnostics exam. That's like the first part. And then usually what ends up happening is you'll go through with a tutor in a class kind of a lot of the material from that first diagnostic exam and see what are the areas where you really understand the material. Maybe you're really good at revising and editing. You really know how to do grammar and punctuation and identify what the most precise or concise way of saying something is. Maybe you're really good at poetry, but you struggle more with the nonfiction passages. So that's a big part of the diagnostic exam, is just figuring out kind of where your strengths are and then where you want to spend your time focusing. And then you kind of get to read over those things, do a lot of reading on your own time, and then setting a goal score, kind of saying, which schools do I like? What school feels like the right fit for me? And then figuring out kind of where do I want to put my goal score so that I can get into the schools that I really care about or that seem like a good fit for me.
Yeah. And a lot of the schools, unfortunately, you can't visit until the fall. So you have to decide now whether you're going to prep for this exam without being able to visit the schools first. The exception to that is Bronx Science. They have a spring tour that you can do, which is my alma mater. That's where I went to school. Loved it. But you can get a really strong sense by going to the school's websites. Most of them have like an online tour you can do, something pre-recorded. You can go to their Facebook pages, their Instagram pages, and sort of figure out what the school's all about. Yeah, and we're happy to help too if you have questions about any of this. Um, one thing that is important, and I think probably most of you know this, is that the only way to get into these schools is to take this test. They don't, for these 8 schools, they don't care about your grades or your attendance or whether you can write a good essay. It's just this test, and you only have the chance to take it once in the fall of 8th grade. So when you set a goal score, think about what are schools that you might be interested in. And then we always encourage you to set it higher than you think. So if you are really not interested in Stuyvesant, but you want Bronx Science, look at what the cutoff scores have been for Bronx Science, and then maybe set it like 50 points higher, because if you're getting 50 points higher on your diagnostic tests, then if you are really, really nervous on test day, or I don't know, there's a fire truck outside that's distracting you, or you have a headache, or things happen. You might get a few questions wrong that you wouldn't normally get wrong, but then you'll still be okay because you were aiming for a higher score. So that's also a good recommendation. We have read here in capital letters. I know we've talked a lot about how important reading is, but one thing that maybe you saw in when Sid was going through the math section is that even the math questions can sometimes be a reading test. And those are the tricks that they were talking about. How the test tries to trick you with the words. So many word problems, and that also requires you to be a really fantastic and careful reader. So really, really important to read. Reading is one way to study for a test without studying. You might be really enjoying what you're learning. It doesn't feel what you're reading. It doesn't feel like studying, but actually you're studying. The other thing I wanted to say is that, I saw some of you were really engaged with the questions and you knew the answers. Maybe you'd seen some of these tests before because you started prepping already. And maybe some of you saw some of these questions and said, oh my God, I haven't learned this in school at all. This seems so hard. And I just want to say that a lot of our seventh graders and eighth graders who are studying for this test are really happy that they studied for it, even if in the end they decided not to go to a specialized school, because you learn all of this stuff that maybe your teacher didn't cover because of COVID. Maybe you didn't learn some of these grammar rules because, you had those COVID years in elementary school, or um, you know, for whatever reason, your school didn't get to algebra yet at all. But this will make you such a more confident eighth grader and also high school student. So there's really no downside to kind of sitting down and prepping for this test, and then getting to that place where you're really, really confident in your reading skills and your grammar skills and in your math skills.
And these testing skills, this is one test, but when you build up a test, like your ability to do tests and your testing skills, it applies to other tests too. So
Yeah,
I will say, like, the skills that you learn and practice here will be helpful later on in high school when you work on standardized tests for college as well.
perfect. Perfect. Yeah, so I know, and that's kind of incredible, right? Standardized tests, they do share a lot of things in common. So you'll continue learning using these skills for sure. So, um, yeah, well, I think Sid talked a lot about how important it is to time yourself well. That's one of the biggest challenges and one of the most important strategies that we teach is time management. And you definitely want to be in a position when you're done prepping for this. It's October, it's early November, where you're not leaving any blank, right? That's sort of the worst case scenario.
Even if you're putting in C for every answer that you can't figure out, that's exactly what you should do. We
Right.
encourage students to make the best guess that they can. If they feel like they are sure that it's between two answers, obviously pick one of the two that you're thinking it's between. But if you have no idea, pick the same answer choice for all of the ones you're guessing for. That's just a good probability strategy.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But
Um,
hopefully by the time you get to test date, your timing has improved so much that you don't have to, pick a bunch of questions, a whole bunch of questions, and answer the same thing.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so these are kind of just some other, and also we have a couple minutes left for Q&A. So if there's any questions that you have for us, happy to answer.
Yeah. I want to talk about a little bit about this point about the committed student. If there are any parents on here, I get asked by parents all the time. We get this question all the time, like, well, how come some students started with a 350 and got to, a 550, and other students didn't make that much gain. And well, what we always say is that it depends on whether the student is really excited about going to these schools and is doing it because they're internally motivated, versus the parents are saying, you have to go to a specialized school. It's really important to me, the parent, right? So that's really what it comes down to. And if the student's committed and excited and surrounded by a community also of students who are prepping for this test, which is why the semi-private classes are great. There are just 3 to 6 students in the class, but they have a little community and they're all doing this together. There's accountability. If somebody's shy and then they have questions, but they're not asking them, maybe somebody else will ask the question or make a mistake that you made, but you didn't want to say that you made that mistake. So lots of kind of healthy community stuff going on in those classes. And then the students, they see that it's cool to do their SHSAT homework, right? That you got to do it. You got to do the reading. You got to do the work that SIT assigns. And if you follow that formula and you're internally motivated, all of our students see progress for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, guys, does anybody have any questions for Sid? Or you can also maybe type in the chat if you, like, what do you think is the hardest part of SHSAT, of SHSAT? What were the hardest questions? We got a no questions. Somebody said no. What's the average amount of points you can improve if you study with a tutor? Okay, so our students go up like, it's such a huge range between, well, this is a good math question. They go up approximately between like 10 and 50%, right? So, if, so if you average that number, um, it's about 20, like, 20-ish% that students go up. So it depends on your starting score, right? So this year we have students who started in the 300s, students who started in the 400s, very, very, very few students who started at like 500. Maybe they go to a school where the math is super advanced. Um, but yeah, expect that you'll go up 20 to 40%, I would say, is kind of the middle of that bell curve.
I see a
I
question
let,
about our set lessons given in a central location or all over the city. So we
yeah,
have an in-person office space at 1460 Broadway. It's a WeWork location, and so that's where the semi-privates generally take place.
yep.
But if you're doing one-on-one tutoring, that can happen at a library near you. That can happen in your home. It can happen at a coffee shop, or theoretically a different WeWork location. Is that right, Lisa?
Yeah, totally. So, yeah, right now we have classes going on at 1460 Broadway, which is on 41st Street between Broadway and 6th Avenue. And those are on the weekends. We're going to be doing classes there in the summer as well. I can send you guys more info about that. And then yes, we sometimes have classes in Brooklyn as well. So they're semi-private classes. They're very small. So a lot of the time, students will come up to us and say, you know what, me and 3 friends, we want to do a class. Can you do that for us? And we can even do that next to your home somewhere, or at a library, or even at your house. Or if you have in your building a room that we can use, something like that. But yes, our main location is on 41st and Broadway. Um, but if you have a private tutor, the tutor comes to your house or to your school or to a library near home or school, so that we travel all over. What magazines should I try? Um, okay, so that depends on what you like to read, because you definitely want to be reading things you like. But in general, I think The New Yorker is great. I really like reading The Economist, and I personally really love to read about like new inventions and new things that are happening in like science and technology. So when I get The Economist, I flip to the back page, because every week they tell you about like new inventions and new patents and things like that. And I get super excited about that. The New York Times is great.
National Geographic is great.
Yes, love National Geographic.
Scientific
Um,
American is awesome. Yeah, I love reading Scientific
yes,
American.
yes. Um, yeah, the Science Times on Tuesdays I like. Um, so it depends on what you like to read. But definitely have something that you're either getting an article every day, or a whole magazine to get through every week. Um,
Any other questions?
Great.
If
Uh,
not, you can type your one word checkout maybe. How are you feeling at the end of this? Uh,
yes. Great, great idea. How's one word? How's everyone feeling? Um, I'm gonna say learning. Chill, good, excited. Love this. Thanks,
yeah.
guys, for participating. I
Thank you
hope
so
you
much
learned
for
something.
participating.
All right. Well, Sid, you're awesome. Thank you so much. Should I listen to audiobooks or use a Kindle? Definitely use a Kindle.
Yeah, that'll help practice more of the skills uh, of of punctuation and grammar and noticing words that you don't know.
Yeah, for sure. Because if you think about the way you're going to be taking the SHSAT, you're going to be reading it more like a Kindle, right? You're not going to be listening to it. So you got to practice that skill. just like the test. All right, guys. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Sid. This was awesome. And we'll be in touch with you guys and tell you more about Sid's future classes and other classes that we have and more ways how you can prep for the SHSAT. Have great
Great.
weekends.
Have a great weekend, everybody.
Bye.